I was asked to investigate, or I was asked to give information which I refused to give without investigating, and then really completely hung out to dry, and had the worst experience of bullying I've ever experienced in my life. And so the clinicians we have in the NHS are absolutely amazing. The problem that we have is the culture is not listening to them. We've got to start embracing the idea that we can work collaboratively in changing culture, and that changing culture needs to start from the top. So it means that what we're building cannot be, if you like, a compromise. Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm an occupational psychologist, and I have developed tech myself. I've been in the wellbeing space for since the late 1990s, when I was winning awards for tech development in wellbeing, which is before anybody really was interested in wellbeing, to be perfectly honest. But so it's always been a passion of mine all the way through my career. And I've also been involved and worked within the NHS after I had a head injury in 2004. I had 2 years when I couldn't work, and then after getting well enough to work, I couldn't travel anymore, and as a result, I ended up working in the NHS locally to me, running a practice, a medical practice. So I've got experience in the NHS, and furthermore, I've got experience as a whistleblower, as I raised concerns at the practice. Actually, I was asked to investigate, or I was asked to give information which I refused to give without investigating, and then really completely hung out to dry, and had the worst experience of bullying I've ever experienced in my life. And so indeed, the senior partner of the practice, who was also a whistleblower, data managers, the assistant business manager, all of whom we were all thrown out ultimately. And it was quite a big deal. It was in the paper as well, and it was all over social media and goodness knows what. So I've had the experience from both sides. You know, I'm involved in the wellbeing space. I'm involved in wellbeing tech, but I'm also an ex-NHS whistleblower, and that has very much formed my way of thinking about the workplace and how we need to create cultures in the workplace. Because the whistleblowing element is a symptom. The need for whistleblowing is a symptom of the unhealthy workplaces that we have, in my view. And my mission is actually to make work a joyful place to be. And you can only have it a joyful place to be if you actually ensure that the right support and security is in place for the human beings that work in it. Because after all, we wouldn't expect our computers to be working at 40% capability, but we expect people to work no matter what's going on for them. So for me, it's really bringing the two things together is very important. The tech that can support well-being, and also understanding the culture that is undermining well-being.
Amazing, absolutely. And so this was an experience that went over years and years and years. And I'm just wondering how the chronicness of this, that it takes so long to get something achieved or said, how does that impact people in the short term, and then the years to come, even after 20 years, you know? And is anyone measuring this, paying attention to this, listening to people still?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because after the Francis report, I was invited by NHS England to join a panel that was to look at how we deal with bullying in the workplace in the NHS, to try to eradicate bullying. And that was all we did. We had a panel, and I'm not aware of anything that went on from there. And what was really interesting is that we had a case study that we reviewed, which was fantastic, wonderful case study, where the CEO of a trust had brought somebody in and their role was to eradicate the fear of raising concerns. And what was wonderful about that was that the CEO was really behind it at every step. And the biggest problem is that that is not the way it really is in reality. In reality, you don't have the people at the top who are in a position. So I'm not saying this to be judgmental and blaming, but it's just reality. The reality is the people at the top are under massive pressure from higher up, from the Department of Health. And the Department of Health are saying, achieve your targets. So, you know, the leaders of the organisation are fundamentally focused in a very narrow way on their targets. And this is why you're going to get bullying. Because if a tyrannical culture is successful, then it breeds more tyranny. And success I put in a kind of very broad sense, in that if you consider achieving targets successful, then, and you achieve your targets, then you are considered successful. But as we know from what you've just been describing, achieving targets is absolutely meaningless when there are people, children, babies who are dying. And this is one of the reasons that I'm also very much involved with Jonathan Hassan, who designed some technology for patient safety. And that's actually right around the world now. And he's actually set up a foundation called Patient Safety Learning. And I'm going to give that a little plug, because if anyone's involved in the NHS and they are having any concerns, and it is a very good place to go. The whole idea, Helen Hughes runs this charitable foundation. The whole idea behind it is that if we learn from mistakes, we all grow, and we then avoid near misses turning into big problems. And that's really what I think is at the heart of a good culture, the ability to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't know, I've made a mistake. Maybe we should review this. Maybe we should hold our hands up and say we did something wrong, without actually that leading to you being blamed and sidelined and, you know, all the rest of it. And that is not what's happening at the moment.
It's amazing. You said two things. So one about, there's almost this stigma, or well, there is stigma around enormous. And yeah, and trying to shift the culture and create psychological safe spaces for people to raise concerns, because they're not even concerns. They don't have to be concerns. They can be constructive feedback, and be very helpful. I think it's, yeah, changing that impression or the way people view things and embedding it from the start. And the feedback is so valuable and important. I think the values.
We know that, don't we? I mean, we all know feedback is useful. It's just not always comfortable to receive it. And the
Right.
receiving feedback has sent us into this crazy world where consultants in hospitals have to wear this arrogant protective shell, because they're afraid, this is my perspective, they're afraid that their professional judgment is going to be attacked even, or questioned at the very least, if they don't come across as absolutely all-knowing. And there is a lot in the education through the NHS, a lot in the education of how do we educate young people to go into the role, which might lead them to be in a senior position, clinical position in a trust or in the health service generally. And we're often doing it by making them feel like they can act with impunity, that you know everything, you are the top 5% of the population, you are brilliant. So when a patient says, I have a concern, then I'm less likely to listen, because I am the top 5% of the population. And it is kind of drummed in. And that is part, I think, of the issue. But what I would say is the clinicians we have in the NHS are absolutely amazing. The problem that we have is the culture is not listening to them. And this is the thing, it's not that we've got problems with our consultants and with our nurses and, oh my goodness, no, I'm so fed up with hearing about that. The problem is not there. The problem is the system that is making it impossible for them, their brains to function properly, impossible for them to be able to do their jobs and use their professional judgment. And when they do, if it goes wrong, which it does sometimes, you know, you can't always get everything right. And sometimes you have to take a bit of a risk because if you don't, you lose more than you might potentially gain. There's all of those kind of arguments around it. But if you get something wrong, you're likely to be in the firing line, because it's you know, a bit of a shoot the messenger thing as well. So, you know, if you get it wrong, either you have to blame somebody else or you're going to be in trouble. Now, I've spoken to loads of NHS whistleblowers. Most of the ones I've spoken to are not in post anymore. A wonderful heart surgeon that hasn't been in post for about 15 years while he's waiting for them to decide what to do with him effectively. He can't get a job. We need people like that. You know, we need people that will say, I don't think this is right. That doesn't make them a problem. That makes them an asset.
Yes.
So,
value. Yes.
huge value. As a patient, I would like to go into a hospital where the doctor will say, I don't know if this is right. I think I'll check it. I don't want to go into a hospital where the doctor say, everything's fine. You know, so, and I think most people, you know, if we understand what the culture is trying to achieve, we will be able to accept when the doctors say, I can't give you a definitive because I want to check. We'll understand that. But I think at the moment, it's not okay for our clinicians to be like that. And I think that's still the case, I have to say, even with all of the Francis report, I think, scratched the surface, but I still think there is a huge, long way to go.
Okay. And in what way did it scratch the surface? Because I wanted to ask you about your views on the report, and has it changed? What's changed?
I think there have been changes. I would like to think that they were really embedded, but I think the biggest problem that we have is that we haven't changed the culture. So we talk about changing the culture, but we haven't actually changed the culture. So we've got the concept of culture change, which is being superimposed onto a culture that is still very much very hierarchical. There is quite a division between management and the clinicians that work in it. And I know there are, I'm not trying to, you know, paint everyone with the same brush. I know there are loads of trusts that are really working hard. I know one locally to me who is doing amazing work. They're using Kaizen ideas, they're making sure everybody is involved, looking at what's going on all the time, talking to everybody, what, you know, checking every day what's on our whiteboard of things that we've got to deal with. They've got an idea which we have to think, I have to get this right way round, inch wide, mile deep, that's it. So that they like to focus, I don't want to get the wrong way around, like to focus on really clear problems and get right in and drill down into them and solve them. So I'm not saying that everybody is the same, but what I am saying is it is difficult. So if you are a foundation trust, it's easier to do that because you can get on and do your own thing. When you are otherwise an acute trust, it is more difficult. And there is a lot of pressure from above to achieve targets. Like I say, and a lot of those targets, to be perfectly honest, are, in my view, pretty meaningless. So my personal view is that to make the Francis report have real weight, there are two things that need to happen. One, we need to review what we think in terms of targets for the NHS. And I think we need to move away from quantitative targets where we're saying how many hours was somebody waiting, because what we're getting is workarounds. If you're going to be waiting for 2 hours, I'll get somebody to assess you, and then you can wait for 4 hours, and I've ticked off my you haven't waited for more than 2 hours. So there are workarounds which people have to do because they're frightened of not achieving their targets. That's not great for the patients. So that's one element of it, I think, is that we have to change the way we think of targets. And I think the easiest way to change that is to think that the main target we need to be achieving is patient satisfaction. If the patients say, I'm happy with the service, it took me 4 hours to get seen, but when I was seen, it was great. I got what I needed. I understand it took me 4 hours because somebody came in before me with a heart attack, and that was more important than, you know, than the fact that I'd sprained my ankle. So, you know, because people do get that. They know that there are priorities, and if they're explained, it makes sense. So I think that's one really important thing. What do patients feel was the outcome? And if patients feel the outcome was a positive outcome for them, then we know that we're getting it right. And if the patients say, no, I didn't like it, nobody spoke to me, I felt that they didn't, the procedure didn't work for me or whatever, then we know that we're getting it wrong. So that kind of seemed to be from a simplistic point of view, but there you go. One really important thing. And the other thing which the Francis report didn't address, although it was very clear about the bullying that had gone on and had spoken to a lot of people that had been bullied, I don't feel it did very much to actually change anything about the bullying. And the reason for that is because what we really need to change is the law as it pertains to whistleblowers. So at the moment, you can, if you're sacked because you're a whistleblower, as I effectively was, you can say, this is unfair dismissal because I was a whistleblower. But there's a big issue here, and that is that you have to prove that you blew the whistle in good faith. So that means you have to have had no reason other than your concern to have raised that concern. All the other party has to do is to say it wasn't done in good faith. Now, how does the other party prove it wasn't done in good faith? Well, the best thing to do is to bully the whistleblower. Then the whistleblower who is bullied has a case against you. And then you say, see, they've got a case against me. That's why it's not in good faith. So therefore, then the whistleblowing protection no longer exists. The good faith element of the whistleblowing law needs to be removed because it does absolutely nothing to protect patients. All it's doing is protecting employers. And if somebody raises a concern and it isn't a justifiable concern, and you can prove that it's not a justifiable concern, or that they misunderstood or whatever, well, there is really very little that is at risk, particularly if you're protecting the reputations of people until the reporting and the disciplinaries or whatever has been completed. So I think for the sake of protecting people who are working in the structure against protecting patients, we should be removing that. And this is why I think there is so much bullying, because as soon as you've got someone raising a concern about you, the best thing to do is to attack. And then the more you do that, the person who's raising the concern is having to bat off all of these attacks, and then they become the problem.
It's incredible. So how, even even from different perspectives, but how can digital mental health providers, obviously they can't change the law, we can try to make this happen altogether, but how can they themselves try and support that culture change, or, you know, just sidestepping, doing something within their whistleblowing policies, which I'm sure many don't even have yet, but that's step one, I think. But then we have the policies, but then we have, like, what else can we do in digital mental health to really just change our course?
I think the first thing is to think about your own culture and what your own culture is creating. I talk about different types of cultures, and where you get problems that need whistleblowers, you normally have what I would call a vampire culture. So it's a culture where people's well-being levels are lower, and their brain performance is lower, and they're being reactive. And that also leads to less ethical behavior. And this isn't anyone's fault. It's that your brain literally starts to close down, and some of the behaviors that would be accessible to you are just no longer accessible to you, because when you feel like, and I don't know if you've ever experienced that kind of vampire culture where you just feel like you're on edge all the time because you're not quite sure what's going to happen next, and you think it's okay and it seems fine and everything's great today, but you're just not, something might happen, you know, that kind of feeling like there might be something just in the background. It just keeps people on edge, and that on edge is actually a state of hyperarousal. So you're constantly in a state of hyperarousal. That reduces your capacity to be able to kind of think clearly. So that is a kind of typical culture of where things start to go wrong. And if that isn't put right, that culture starts turning into what I call a zombie culture. So we then go from hyperarousal to hypoarousal, and we start shutting our brains down. That's when we want to have duvet days, or where we just leave me alone, I don't want to talk about it. And that is exactly the culture that led to the biggest NHS scandal. I've written a paper actually, which you can get free, called Zombification in the NHS. And it is about the zombifying of people. So these amazing clinicians who were told, you've got to be retrained, you don't care enough. And that makes me get very cross actually, because of course they care. Nobody goes into nursing. Well, I mean, maybe a one or two, there are very, very few, go into nursing or into medicine because they don't care. They go in because it's a vocation. And when you're in it, the pressure is such that you go from hyper to hypoarousal. If I'm going to do this job, I have to just focus on that. That's what my brain is making me do, just one thing. I can't even physically, and I mean physically, see what is in my peripheral vision. Yeah. So when I'm in that state, my brain does not allow me to view what is around me. So somebody in that bed may be feeling really ill. I won't see it, physically will not see it, because it will not be translated into my brain. Mm-hmm. So because of that, that's when we end up with people who miss the most obvious things because they're focused on one thing. And that's where this whole scandal came about. You've got nurses who, in a lot of cases, you've got nurses who have been under so much pressure and they're doing their best. They're going in every day and they're trying to do their best, but they can't be at their best. Yep. So to be at your best, you've got to have a high level of well-being, and you've also got to have a high level of brain performance, so that the two go together. And if you can do that, I would say in this space, the most important thing is to build this, what I call Phoenix culture. So this is a culture where we can say, I got it wrong, I don't know how to do this, and out of the ashes, we burst forth with new, better, and it's a collaborative, co-creating space. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
you have.
Not the best too, but I think that's how I would look at it. It's really, there is no downside to well-being. There is no downside to well-being. If you focus on the well-being, everything else happens. It all kind of falls into place. But if you don't focus on the well-being, then you've got a very, very difficult mountain to climb in terms of, trying to achieve what you want to achieve in the way that you want to achieve it. So,
okay.
Let's start with that.
Very, very good. That was very helpful. Vampire, zombie, and Phoenix. That's yes. Good. So now I want to kind of revisit your experiences of the past, but imagine now you have technology, a lot more technology in this space. And how would you feel back then about being tracked or monitored, or use your mood being measured, and all of these kind of things that can be wonderful, this kind of digital innovation to support workplace, etc. But how would you feel the kind of the benefits, but also the risks in building trust between employers, employees, and how can you reimagine that in that context?
Well, I think there's always a danger, isn't there, of it appearing invasive. And I think any technology has to be confidential. And if you're taking data, it has to be taken confidentially. And that's what I do with my tech. All the information we take from individuals is all completely confidential to the individual, but we can draw information out of it, which is really helpful. And it gives us an opportunity to be able to monitor what's going on overall and actually in different granular levels and different protected groups, whatever. So I think that from my perspective, going back to the days when I was, going through the hell is what I would call it of being a whistleblower, I think anything that acknowledged where I was at would have been incredibly helpful. I used to drive into work because I had a really pretty horrific psychopathic bullying experience. And I would drive into work, pull myself up by the bootstraps, drive into work. And as I'm driving into work, I'm thinking, yes, I'm going to do it today. And then I'd just start crying and crying and crying. I'd get all my makeup would be off by the time I got to work, and then I'd park my car, pull myself together, wipe my eyes, take a deep breath, and then I'd have to get to my office, and I had to go past reception to do it. And sometimes I couldn't even bear to speak to the people in reception. I'd have to try and get morning, because I was just feeling so awful. And it was so lonely. It was such a lonely place. And even though there was, the senior partner was also a whistleblower, and there were other people, it was still, you still feel very lonely. And because of the nature of psychopathic bullying, which happens a lot, it tends to have this very divisive effect. So there are those people who love the person that you have concerns about, and there are those people that can't stand them. And it's very much, there's this kind of Marmite thing, you know, you love them or you hate them. But there's an element of it that we call the psychopathic fiction, which is where the perpetrator is telling all sorts of stories and make it to a nice little select group of people, which makes you further and further removed. And so you're further and further alienated. And they have created this kind of unbreakable bond. So yeah, you do feel very alone. You lack the feeling of being acknowledged. And certainly I think one of the things which was really important to me is that factual evidence wasn't taken into account. Much more interest in protecting people who shout a lot. So, you know, I'm going, oh, how dare you, you know, that kind of thing held a lot of weight, much more weight than I've got the evidence that proves it.
Yes.
And I think, especially looking at what happens with people who are whistleblowers, a lot of what's going on is under the surface. It's microaggressions that are happening moment by moment. It's coming into your office and finding a letter on your desk with your name on it and thinking, oh gosh, what is it this time? It's you being told to do something, and then the people you've been told, who are your team, being told to complain about it when you do it. So these kind of things are going on all the time. And I mean, I experience a lot of sexual harassment as well. And it's all about power, and it's all about making you feel kind of undermined. So I think when we're looking at this, we need to be looking at the real problems, which are the microaggressions, the covert behaviours, more than the obvious stuff. And the patterns that build up as well. And I think that's really important. It's this overall pattern. One of the things that's really interesting about dealing with psychopaths, and very often there are psychopaths at work here. I mean, bearing in mind I think about 3 out of every 100 people have psychopathic brain structure. So we're you know, there are quite a lot of them. And in senior positions in organisations, I think Clive Boddy, who's a fantastic expert on psychopaths in the corporate world. So if you want to know more about him, you know, look him up. He was also on the panel, by the way, looking at bullying in the workplace. Clive, I think, reckons that it's around about 30% of all CEOs are probably psychopaths. So we're, you know, that's a lot of people. So when you're looking at it from that perspective, understanding the way that psychopaths work is actually really important. And one of the things that you'll notice is that they will stay as cool, as calm as can be when you are the one who's going kind of like out of your tree, because it's so frustrating. It's like, but can't anybody understand? And they'll just be, see, this is what I have to deal with. You see, this person.
Wow.
And that happens in relationships as well, I might add. A lot of people talk about that in relationships where, you know, where they're sitting in front of the mediator and, you know, one of the person's going, I can't stand it anymore. And the other one's going, see. But that is the problem, you know, that when you do blow the whistle, you are looked upon as the problem. Straight away, you are the problem before anything else.
I find that fascinating, especially when you mentioned evidence, and the notion of evidence speaks for itself, and people who don't always have a voice, the evidence should be able to go to where it needs to go. to speak for itself. So how, like, again, I'm thinking of digital mental health community. When there's evidence, where does it go? Where should it go? How do we
What
get
we
it into one place?
what we should be doing is making sure that we're collating the evidence in a
Yes.
meaningful way, and in a way that will enable the right feedback to be given to the right person in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, too much of this is done by subjective analysis of what is going to be appropriate to feedback to somebody at the right time in the right way. And we were saying earlier, we don't always want to hear feedback, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't hear it. And I think this is where digitally we can make a big inroad, which is in actually collecting data that can demonstrate, particularly in the field of whistleblowing, demonstrate that this is not a bias. Well, there's always going to be bias, I accept that, but that this can be presented in a way that is eliminating as much bias as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's just sticking to as many of the facts as possible. So my experience when I was raising concerns, I had like about 3 ring binders full of, it was about that big,
Yep.
of evidence. But the problem was that the people who are reviewing the evidence are taking it, going through each piece of evidence as an individual piece of evidence.
Right.
So they'll say, okay, here is a complaint from a patient who says that this doctor has been making unacceptable comments about her breasts, for example. There's a real example there, could be. So, oh yes, that's not very good. We'll put that down, not very good, but not actually, and this is not my terminology. This is the governance terminology, not a hanging offence, okay? And that expression really bothers me, because they used to say it all the time, oh, it's not a hanging offence. And I'd be like, we don't, first of all, want to hang people for a start, please. And secondly, does something have to be so awful that we don't do anything unless it is unless they are a psychopath killing loads of people, like I can't remember his name now. It'll come to me. But anyway, the doctor from Kent, I think he was. But unless you're somebody who's actually leading directly and deliberately to the demise of people, do we not do anything about it? There needs to be kind of steps and levels to concerns, rather than waiting until it is so awful we have nowhere else to go apart from to, throw everything up in the air. So, and I think also we need to gather data and look at data in terms of how each of it adds to an overall picture of what is going on.
Yes.
So if I've got a letter saying patient's not very happy about the way a doctor was talking to them, that is important when I've got another piece of research that shows that a doctor is actually carrying out minor surgery and disfiguring people. So they actually go together, because then I'm starting to ask myself, what are the communication skills of this doctor? What is his capability, and does these two reflect on each other, rather than going, that's separate, that's separate. They're part of a whole picture. And I think actually finding the right way to draw that information together, so that we can kind of score people in a more rounded way, in order to be able, my view is always, you provide support. Everything that we look at doing in our world of wellbeing is to provide support. So we do, for example, I create a leadership 360. So when people are using our wellbeing tool, we are automatically gathering data about their leader. Mm-hmm. And that information doesn't judge their leader. That information helps us support their leader, because we think everyone is worthy of love and support in the workplace. So, and I think it's the same thing. I think the most important backdrop to all of this is that it is done from the place of support, and not from the place of judgment and blame. Otherwise, we're never going to shift out of this very, very strict, hierarchical kind of culture that just doesn't have room in it for compassion.
Yep. I have so many questions. I will promise to let you go at some point, but there's just a couple more. I'm amazed by how, like I've never been in this position myself directly, but I can just imagine how hard it would be for someone to necessarily want to share information or evidence, but maybe there's someone close to them that wants to, that's encouraging them to do so. And to have like a some companion or someone who's helping you bring that information forward, can that count? How can that, if someone doesn't want to directly go bring it forward, can they have someone support it? Or like how can we help people who are very vulnerable already and they don't want to, they're not strong enough to say, I've got the evidence, here I come. How can we get more support from other people to go forward for them, but recognizing it's tricky? It's
Absolutely. This is really interesting because in my personal experience, I can talk about that because I had a number of people who really were completely behind what I was trying to do, were aware, eventually became aware, because it was, I kept it very much under, under wraps for a long time. I didn't want anybody to know that I was having raising concerns, because I wanted it to be properly investigated and I didn't want to raise attention to it. But because of the level of bullying and because other people were aware that there were things that weren't right. So I had data administrators and data analysts who were bringing evidence to me going, I think you need to talk to the doctor about this. This is concerning me. And then eventually, because it got to the point where eventually I was actually booted out and they were aware why I was booted out. And a lot of them would be saying to me, I just want to keep my job. They could see what had happened to me. They could see
yes,
what happened to the senior partner that everybody absolutely loved, who really had driven the business. And it was his business. He'd been there 17 years. He was booted out. They changed the locks and literally wouldn't let him in. I mean, extraordinary. And all his patients were told he's not here anymore. And then they all protested, I might just add, because he was very, very popular. Unlike the one that booted him out, who was very, very unpopular. But, but the idea that that you can have somebody to support you is a wonderful idea. The reality is, as much as people want to support you, they're so afraid.
yes,
So it's
yeah,
really difficult for a start to actually just raise a concern. Anybody that says I want to raise a concern should always listen to them, because it's such a difficult thing to do. Nobody does it for any, why would you do it for any reason other than wanting to make things better? So Kim
yeah,
Holt, who was the whistleblower in the Baby P case,
yeah,
she raised a concern and actually they didn't listen, and that was very tragic. And she set up Patients at First, which is no longer exists, but it was to help whistleblowers at the time. And she said to me, nobody understands that the only reason you ever raise a concern is to make things better.
yeah,
So, why would they put me on gardening leave? They put her on gardening leave for over a year, I think. It's extraordinary, and all of that resource and, capability is on
yes.
gardening leave. So anyway.
Is Yeah, is it, so it's like a balance in a way that there should be the freedom to act almost anonymously to push information forward, but to have an open culture of being able to do it if you feel that you're ready and willing and able. But how do you balance?
The role of digital has to be to enable the culture to become more open. I mean, it
Okay, okay,
has to be, because if it doesn't do that, then it will keep pushing whistleblowing into a covert space. And then it
interesting.
starts being used as a weapon against other people. So you
Wow.
start raising concerns and it becomes weaponized, because that concern now can be used against you. And I know that this has happened in other forms of kind of management of learning and things like that, where it can actually end up being a weapon. So what it has to do, it has to open the culture. The biggest challenge that we have is getting the most senior people to refuse to allow the Department of Health to bully them. So it has to start at the top. So the most senior people have got to stand up to the Department of Health. And if they can't do that, then don't expect your people to stand up for what's right in your organisation. It has to come
Wow.
from the top, always. Leaders have to be the change they want to see. And that starts with yourself. So it's a big ask. Leaders need a lot of support to be able to do that. And their boards have to be behind them to do that. But we have to start saying patients must come first. Targets are only evidence that we are getting it right, not that they come first.
Yeah. Gosh, my mind is blown. So I guess we should wrap up, but I want to, well, first promise you I will try and circulate this video far and wide, up as high as possible, all the way to the sky, but also importantly to people with lived experiences and people who want to have a say in how digital mental health is going to try and tackle the issues, but in an open culture. So, because I think there's a lot of positive stuff that can be done. So I guess to end things, what would you say are maybe like the next step or a couple ideas that are really concrete and tangible that we could consider as a community to serve a greater good? Because we are quite a tight community, and I feel like we could hopefully do some shifting here as we're doing with cybersecurity. So yeah, what are your thoughts on, guide us a little bit here on where we should be taking those first steps, and then maybe one aspirational longer vision?
I think as a digital community, we've got to start embracing the idea that we can work collaboratively in changing culture, and that changing culture needs to start from the top. So it means that what we're building cannot be, if you like, a compromise. And I'm quite clear about this. You know, I will not compromise on my values, but I'll compromise on almost everything else. But I won't compromise on my values. And I think it's really important in this space that we hold fast to each other, actually, and say, no, there is not going to be a compromise. We're not going to create weaponized systems. We're going to create systems that every single individual must be engaged in from the top down. And we have to drive, and I think we can do this, we have to drive a new way of thinking about what is going on in the world of health. Mm-hmm. And we're in a very special space to do that, if we stick together. Because the danger is that we become fragmented by the demands that are put upon us to create things that will do the job management wants it to do. Mm-hmm. And we need to make sure that we're doing the job that is right for the patients and the people supporting the patients primarily. Everything else is secondary. And if you do that, you have far less need for management, actually, because a lot of what management is doing is trying to funnel people into the right place at the right time without knowing what the right place and the right time actually is very often. So doing their best, but they're almost given an impossible task. So yeah. If as a community, we can look at developing software that works from a bottom up and top down perspective, we'll be getting it about right. So we can meet in the middle and know that we're looking after the patients that way, and we're making sure that the business is looked after this way. That's kind of that's not very tangible, but that's my thinking. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm working with the Sussex and Brighton and Sussex School of Medicine to look at developing some software for wellbeing.
Fantastic.
I'm really interested to hear what anybody else is doing, because I'm really big on collaboration. I think that that's the only way that we can actually drive real change. And if there are people that are really, really keen to make a change in the world, then, you know, that's something I would be interested in hearing more about, because I think there are ways that we can work together to make it a better place, this world, especially in medicine, and especially right now, and especially with the fact that so many of these clinicians have had a really horrendous time during COVID. And yes. What we need to do first and foremost is look after them and give them compassion and give them support And any new systems that come in, my goodness me, they have to be clinician centered, because they're just not going to be able to cope with them otherwise.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Maria. And to add especially our audience as well, we're very community and collaborative focused. So I have a good feeling about this message getting out. But I want to thank you so much for your time, all of these insights. It's so complex, but you really help to kind of tease things apart and do so in a positive way that I think offers like hope, and hopefully people can really gain a lot from this. And so just thank you so much for your time. And yeah, and we'll have to stay in touch and see what happens.
I'd really love to hear anything that might might come out of this. Always interested, and I'm very happy to to provide any support, guidance, or anything that I can do to make this a better place.